Hey everybody! Welcome to another installment of The Red Web with Brad West. I am your host, along with my fantabulous co-host, Miss Anastasia. And of course, on loan from us from Dragon's Lair Comics and Fantasy, Greg Burrow. He is a better comic historian than me on a lot of things, so it's amazing. And of course, Miss Anna always has fantastic insight. Today, I'm coming to you from my back. I am recovering from back injury, so you'll just have to have chill Brad today. And we're going to be talking about censorship in comic books. This is the first of a two-part exploration. And we're going to start off talking about the golden age of censorship in comic books. So we're going to basically start with the difference between comics from the past, what they were able to do, but also what they weren't able to do. The prejudices and the holdbacks from the time period that were going on because of politics, because of the war, because of, still structured racism and a whole level of things that were just socially imposed, all the way up to scandals and congressional hearings and the formation of the ever popularly discussed Comics Code Authority, which was a self-regulatory brand for a while. And we're going to even touch on a few of the comic books that came out after the Code Authority and basically just examine what the initial impact of said rating system had on the comic books, especially superheroes, because that's what we talk about here, superheroes. So who wants to start off? Greg, you want to tell us about the pre-Code Authority, basically the beginning of comics?
Honestly, I think the beginning of comics goes all the way back to the Stone Age when they were drawing pictures on walls of, hunts that went really well or whatever,
That's the original sequential art.
Yes. So, but honestly, I mean, there were art stories throughout history,
Right.
Really. I mean, even like the great masters would even do sequential art, paintings of like things that would happen in sequence.
Well, that would be a great subject to talk on one day. Right now, though, we're mostly talking about the printed comic books. Originally, printed comic books were a way for presses to make extra money. So you had presses that printed newspapers, and you had your political comics, and you had some funny comics, and there was daily strips is what it came down to. And then there were the weekend editions, of course. But then there were days on the weekend where nothing was getting printed. So what they started doing was they would take the daily strips, usually of funny comics that were popular at the time, collect them into a comic, what we call a comic book now, into a single format, which was like a reprint of several of these together. And it gave the printers themselves something to do on the weekend and the off time to make extra money. And they became very popular. They were very inexpensive. When you look back on the times for, those were already paid for. The advertisement was already paid for by the newspaper. There wasn't really any need for them to go beyond that. So they were really cheap to produce, and they helped the printer company's publication recover some money. Well, it didn't take long before those got popular enough that they realized original content would sell even better. And that's what kind of set off the modern comic book as we know it. Now, 1938 comes around. You've already had radio serials, and we've already talked about the evolution of the superhero archetype. So you check that episode out if you want to see how it came from superhero strips from comic book strips to superheroes. But 1938, of course, starts the superheroes, and that's the big boom. That's where you have the super arms race. Everybody and their mother has got a new superhero coming out. From Superman to Captain Marvel to Blue Beetle, all over the place. So what are we talking about? Early impositions, societal restraints, things that the publishers themselves censored out of the comics.
Well, I mean, there was a lot of things, but I think that the biggest thing is that there were people that were forced to change their names in order to be published.
That was one.
Jack Kirby is not Jack Kirby's real name. Jack Kirby is actually Jacob Kurtzberg. Stan Lee is Stanley Martin Lieber. Joe Simon, who created Captain America, is Jaime Simon.
Yeah. So Joe Simon's a really important one because this is way pre-Marvel when Captain America was National Publications, right?
So.
So Captain America was created by a man of Latino background. So, Jaime. But we're still at a time when minorities were not given jobs. And if you could pass for white, you took advantage of that. And that was Hispanics, Jews, anybody who was in it. So you go back and check the history of the publications. There was so much of that, Spiegel and Schuster, hid the fact that they were Jewish to get their publications done. And so any kind of stuff like that was kept out of comic books. And especially when you get to the war era comic books, it's all propaganda. There's no way around it. They were highly, highly edited to favor the war, even to the point of Superman selling bonds in the comic books.
Oh, I remember that.
Yeah. So there was.
I mean, it even went all the way over to Disney. Disney was big in the propaganda machine.
Yep.
They
Oh yeah, that's
Disney shut down pretty much almost everything. I think the only thing that they were working on was Dumbo.
Oh.
Yeah.
At that time, everything else was all propaganda.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was all entertainment focused on. It's like whenever
and it's not
everyone
necessarily
had to play their part, it was comics.
Yep. And it's not necessarily a superhero, but a very, very important part of that history of the propaganda in comic books is many people are familiar with the DuckTales. I love the new DuckTales series. It's really, really good. David Tennant is amazing.
It's awesome. Please watch it.
Yeah, but DuckTales, fun little fact of history, Scrooge McDuck first appeared in a wartime propaganda film from Disney, not as Scrooge McDuck, technically. It was technically a Donald Duck playing a Scrooge-like character who wasn't spending his money to support the war. But that's what led to the Scrooge McDuck comic book being printed and became so popular. And the original Scrooge McDuck comic books were actually pro-war. And so, yeah, that's a little bit of history on Disney and the propaganda machine and that stuff like that. So,
okay.
This was where we get into the superheroes. You start having Batman. Originally was a lot more violent, a lot more crime noir. I mean, the original Batman had guns.
Yeah, the original Batman. It was more of a crime noir,
Dick Tracy type thing.
Dick Tracy type thing, except darker. Because he would go around and he would shoot people. The original Doctor Strange, Hugo Strange, Batman stood out of his house, out of Hugo Strange's house, while the house was burning down to make sure Hugo Strange didn't escape from the house.
That's because Hugo Strange figured out his identity. Yeah. He was the first. Hugo Strange was a psychiatrist, and they used him in later comic books. I know he was big in one of the video games. But Hugo Strange was the first person in DC history to determine Batman's identity by reasonable deduction, because he was a psychiatrist and he figured out, by his behavior, criminal profile before it was called that. He profiled Batman and figured out he was Bruce Wayne, and Batman let him die. So a lot of darker stuff got through back then, which is really funny because they started realizing that there was a huge market for children. Yeah. And they wanted to kind of branch out into that. And so because Superman appealed more to kids and was more colorful and everything like that, that's when they started changing Batman. And in order to soften him out, they added his sidekick Robin. And as Greg loves to point out, if you ever want to see a really good interpretation of why Batman took on Robin, it's the Brave New World.
No. You're thinking about New Frontier.
New Frontier
by Darwin Cook is genius. You must read this book. It is it's set between the Golden Age and the Silver Age, because there was not really a smooth transition between Golden Age and Silver Age, because the Comic Code Authority happened.
And they just plain stopped publishing because they didn't want to screw with it.
They like all of a sudden Batman was no longer dark, black and gray. He was blue and gray, with yellow symbol and all that kind of stuff. And he's got the eyebrows on, and he's a lot more comical. And then they added, they took away the gun. They took away a lot of the darkness of Batman. There was so many. They got rid of Alan Scott Green Lantern entirely. They created Hal Jordan as the Green Lantern and created the entire space.
Started with Carmine Infantino's Flash.
Yeah. So there was a lot of changes, and all of this was to make the comics more kid friendly. But there was no explanation in the comics why all this happened. So New Frontier fits in there and gives you this story that shows the change of all these characters and why they changed into who they became for the Silver Age. And it makes it a logical, wonderful story.
Right.
I mean, some of my favorite Wonder Woman scenes are in there. Obviously,
if you want a really good feminist Wonder Woman, read New Frontier. It is fantastic. They even draw her taller than Superman.
Yes.
I think that's one of my favorite parts of it is that Superman has to look up to her.
I love it.
And that if you see the animated, it's really cool because Lucy Lawless finally plays Wonder Woman, and it's really cool. But in real life, the Comics Code Authority happened, which we're about to get to, and it kind of just deterred them. And the reason the Comics Code Authority came in, because basically there were several things at play. Yeah. One of the first things is this psychiatrist, Dr. Wortham, who is this German psychiatrist, made a name for himself. He decided to target comic books. And many comic books were not for kids. So even though they started printing some for kids because there was a market there was still plenty of market for adults. Many adults read comic books. They soldiers read them. Your average person read them. I mean, every age and every gender. Nowadays, we kind of it took us years again to realize that, girls like comics. So they were not originally written for any one demographic. It was
a general form of entertainment for everybody.
But also that's one of the main reasons why they got one of the top psychiatrists in the world at that time, Moulton, to come in and create Wonder Woman, who actually he was the creator of the lie detector test that's still in use today. Which is
funny because he gave Wonder Woman the truth-telling lasso. Yeah, that's an inside joke thing, is that he actually created the lie detector test, William Marshall Mifflin. And he also, if you believe the Netflix movie, he was in a polyamorous relationship. It was his wife and his girlfriend that helped him develop Wonder Woman. Yeah. So that's a very interesting that's a really good one. So yeah, they were written for everybody at that time. And that included the still popular crime noir that was coming over from your Dick Tracy Shadow type era stuff. And what got really big was horror comics. Now, horror comics, wartime comics, and crime noir comics were all very graphic, very dark. There were pictures of decapitations and mutilations, lots of body horror, monsters, even not necessarily really R-rated language, but very strong language and very adult themes. Mm-hmm. And because there was no differentiating them at the time, kids would spend their money and they might not necessarily know, oh, this is a kid's comic book, this is an adult comic book, outside of, your obvious Disney stuff and everything like that. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the problems that they had. Another was Dr. Wortham was a super big Budinsky. He wanted to make a name for himself. And he basically came up with what in today's media would be, AI generated fake news. I mean, it
was a hit piece.
He doctored so much. I mean, there are Harvard studies to this day dissecting why and how and what and where he came up with this wild information in this book. But the point of it was you have McCarthyism and you have people freaking out about commies and Nazis and everything else like that. And then you're not feeling safe in their homes and not feeling safe with their media. And he causes this panic. And it's really funny. One of the main things he starts to point out is he even though there's absolutely no evidence to it, that Wonder Woman is a lesbian, which is I always find weird because if anything, her power is taken away when men bonded. I mean, okay, yeah, she's into bondage, but the lesbian thing I wouldn't have gotten on my own. But the biggest one was the popularity of teen sidekicks and their portrayal of being with these superheroes and these mentors or whatever without any maternal figures around. Mm-hmm. So, of course, they make the leap to homosexuality and child molestation.
Yep. So if you grew up with the idea that Batman and Robin were gay lovers, that's where you heard it from.
That's where you heard it from. Yeah, he made it a thing, which is really weird. That's where we got our first Batwoman from. The original Batwoman, Kathy Kane, was specifically written to. Oh no! Here's proof that he's not gay because
there's a girl now.
There's a girl Batwoman now.
Oh my god!
And she was so ridiculously feminine on this extreme to prove the point. I mean, she wore a mini skirt, and she had, instead of a utility belt, she had a purse.
That one still blows my mind.
Well,
a purse.
The utility purse doesn't bug me as much as like her gadgets were like compacts with tech in them and like lock picking lipstick cases.
Right. Well, and it's more of a like old timey thing where it's like, what if she has a belt that implies she wears pants? The dirty feminist.
Yep.
It's like the fact that they gave her a purse. Like, that's amazing.
Yeah. And that carried on to a lot of things. It was even years later when Batgirl came out and she became more popular, the 60s Batgirl, because of the TV show, they still wrote her like, there was one issue where she couldn't fight because she had a run in her stockings. Literally, that was the plot of the comic book. Look it up. I swear it's a thing. Batgirl could not fight because she had a run in her costume stockings.
Oh,
did you see the camera test pilot that they did with Batgirl? It's really good. I highly suggest it. There's some things that they did in there that I wish that they had continued on into the series. But yeah, she had like a Bat compact laser. There's a compact that popped open.
Yeah.
Shoot a laser. But and then there was like you were saying, all of her makeup had different tools and stuff.
They were spy gadgets.
It was really cool because when she was Barbara Gordon, she took her hat and then flipped it inside out and it became her cowl.
Oh, that's cool.
She put her cowl on, and stuff like that. So it was really cool that yeah. And then like her coat, she flipped it inside out and it was her cape.
Very cool.
And stuff like that. So
the point is basically that even before the Comics Code Authority,
there was regulation. There
were societal restraints. I mean, it was anti-feminism, it was anti-homosexuality, it was anti-minority, it was all there, and so it really didn't take much, especially after the xenophobia of the wars. It didn't take much for them to get that push. Now, one of his primary backers was a governor of New York at the time, who actually had it out for the gangsters, and the mob was known for a lot, having their finger in a lot of businesses, and the publication comic books was one of them. So he backed it up to basically help him take down the mob. So he it's another reason. Everybody wonders, like, how did this quack, who had all this obviously fake information, get a footing? And that was because we don't have it on the board. I don't remember the name. We're bad with names. But the governor of New York helped propagate this. And it went so far as...
It's like, we can look that up if we need to.
But yeah, it went so far as congressional hearings.
Yeah.
And that's where things start getting really weird. So
I mean, that's why all of a sudden the comic industry as a whole got together and panicked and created the Comic Code Authority.
Right.
Mm-hmm, because
they wanted to self-regulate, because they were really afraid that the government was just going to shut down the comic industry entirely.
Yep. It's like, then that's a good one to talk about, because it's like, for anyone who wants to look it up, the book that Franklin Wortham wrote is called Seduction of the Innocent. At least read a synopsis. It's wild.
Yeah.
But with all of that hoopla that started out, it ended up with, or it's like basically they had a big meeting about it called the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, did y'all know what it covered?
Yes.
Or?
Well, I mean, okay, so basically it's very much the same mentality that we have
with video games
nowadays.
Or D&D.
Or D&D or any of that stuff. It's scapegoat, and it's an easy scapegoat, and it's like you're putting the cart before the horse, because it wasn't so much that all of the kids who read comic books were juvenile delinquents. It was that all the kids were reading comic books, including the juvenile delinquents.
Right.
That wasn't the cause. Everybody was reading comic books. Elvis read comic books. Elvis's cape, he copied that from Captain Marvel Jr., his favorite comic book. I mean, Elvis's famous little collared cape, that's from the original Shazam. So, it's like everybody read comic books, and Elvis wasn't, well, okay, maybe Elvis wasn't like the best one.
Right.
Maybe he was a little off. But it wasn't because of the comic books, it was because of the coat. It wasn't because of the comic books. But yeah, it was just like the mentality back then. People still, it kind of, looking back and going back in the time capsule and seeing this lens of how people reacted to comic books, and then seeing that we still do that crap with video games. It's mind-blowing that it's like,
well, also D&D
going on almost 100 years later.
Anything. I mean,
yeah.
Right. We have these weird panics with media and how it affects children every 20, 30 years.
Yeah, and it's like, who are we going to blame this time? So the comic books got it pretty bad. So yeah, what were some of your favorite? Miss Anastasia here, she read the actual list of the some of the things that they held back. It was just wild.
God,
so this is Comic Code Authority.
Yes,
list of things that comic industry was not allowed to do.
Yes, it is.
It starts off with just the titles.
Yeah,
so a couple of my favorites. Crime shall never be presented in such a way as to create sympathy for the criminal, to promote distrust of the forces of law and justice, or to inspire others with a desire to imitate criminals.
So basically, you must obey, and you must show everybody else obeying.
You can't make cops look bad.
Yeah,
it's like you can't make government officials look bad. It's like the only people who could be bad are the criminals.
So imagine if that were today, that in any media, like in video games, you cannot. So I mean, this is a very modern topical thing, and we're going to talk about it in part 2. But you can see where we're going to get it from here to there is that this long systematic placement of media programming people to give all the power to the police. This is one of the places it starts.
Right. And another good one, it's like for people who've had to watch this stuff when they were kids, this is a lot. The Comics Code Authority is a lot of the reasons why these tropes happen. The big one is inclusions of stories dealing with evil shall be used or shall be published only where the intent is to illustrate a moral issue, and in no case shall evil be presented alluringly, nor so as to injure the sensibilities of the reader. It's like, and linking to that is the good guys always win, bad guys always do not win.
Mm-hmm. And it also motivation. We talked about here on a previous episode that I highly recommend you go rewatch. It's the sympathetic villain trope, which is a very modern thing. And the reason we said that is because of the Code Authority, it would not allow you to sympathize with the villain. Mm-hmm. And that's where we get the idea of the mustache twirly supervillain whose only motivation to be bad is because they're bad.
Right, to be evil.
Yes, and that's why, is because they're not allowed to have any reasoning that people can mimic or understand. Uh-huh. They had to be evil. They had to be evil to be evil. And so, even as we frequently bring up, because, Greg and I do Batman and Robin from the 60s at our charity stuff. And one of the things I find very amusing is that, right off the bat, the censors, before they made it to the show, and even by this point in the 60s, still had to make a point of saying Batman and Robin had to be deputized by the law. So they were not working outside the law. They were working with the law. And they were never allowed to take action until either asking Commissioner Gordon or until having been contacted by Commissioner Gordon first. Yeah. So if you watch the show, you'll notice that the commissioner either calls them and asks for help, or they call him and ask for permission. Mm-hmm. And that's because of the government.
They should always defer to authority.
They always defer to authority. Yeah. So, we'll talk about that with how that diverges later on. But I think that's a really good one. Another one is the quote unquote family values, where they have to portray relationships, and they can't ever portray divorce. Marriage has to be a loving, and they couldn't put strife. They could not question the sanctity of marriage. And on the surface, that seems harmless. Just like some of the other things, like we said, systematic,
right, deference to authority and stuff like that.
And the sanctity of marriage very quickly devolved to anti-homosexual, any non-traditional relationships. So that was one of the ways that they were to enforce that kind of agenda.
Yeah. It's like even the whole idea of the good guys prosper, the bad guys are punished. It's like, especially during the 50s through the 70s, a lot of the bad guys were minorities in some way, shape, or form, or they were some sort of foreign person. It's like, you can think of something as simple as Rocky and Bullwinkle. It's like they always end up being some foreign person with a foreign accent. And when you're
Natasha.
It's like,
but that was like that in the comic books. Yeah, you had so many. And they were easy targets too. Easy targets for, you want to talk about casual racism. I swear, some of the Asian characters, I think, are the most prominent of it.
You can line it up with any point in history.
But man, there's some, like, I love Wonder Woman, and I love that they modernized it in a way, but still the whole concept of egg foo just blows my mind that got published.
Oh God.
It's literally a giant Japanese egg named Egg Foo, and that was a villain with the straw hat. It's bizarre.
Oh
yeah, that's just like off the top of my head. There's so many. But yeah, it was kind of sad. It was kind of sad. And so one of my stories that I found out in my research, and I really enjoy it, and I was learning about the evolution of EC Comics. EC Comics was one of the ones who was predominant in the adult genres. They did horror, they did the crime, they did the war stories, and they even did adult humor. Which one of them, Tales from the Crypt, everybody knows the TV series. Originally, that was a comic book in the 30s.
It looks like a legit comic book. Like, that was one of those things I always wanted.
That's what they did on the show, is they actually paid a lot of homage to the comic book. That's why you have all the comic book flashes. But it was originally a comic book in the 30s, and it was just as graphic in the 30s as the TV shows have become, if not more so. And it was one of the first to get shot down. I find it interesting that they were restricted from using the words horror or crime in the titles,
or weird. That was,
and then the word weird, which we're still trying to figure out, what did weird mean in the 30s that it doesn't mean now.
I feel like maybe it's like a context thing. Like, usually when I see anything where the comic is talking about being weird, it's like a horror comic, or like a creepy sci-fi comic or something.
Weird science, yeah. So they decided they were going to focus more on their
tales.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, they were taking it pretty hard from the Comics Code Authority, and they decided to focus on their sci-fi titles and their humor title, which was Mad. Before Mad was a Mad magazine, it was just Mad Comics.
Before it was the TV show.
Yeah, right, way before the TV show. And this one's a really interesting one because it's about the evolution of how Mad Magazine came to be. But my favorite story is that the publisher of Mad Magazine and one of science fiction fantasy, one of their science fiction magazines, they had a story that they wanted to print, and one of the committee members of the Comics Code Authority really had an ego. He was all about flexing his power on the comics, and he was editing everything left and right just because he could. And EC Comics in their science fiction fantasy book wanted to print this one story, and it got shut down. I can't even find out what the original story was about. It got shut down so bad. So they needed content quick to fill in for an issue that was coming out. And they reprinted a 7-page story from one of their other comics that was from before the Code Authority. And it should have been fine. And
what was the name of the comic?
Judgment Day was the name of the story. And I really, really love this. And I'm going to explore this later, not only on our second part of the censorship, but when we get to, I think we're going to do Black Lives Matter in a couple of weeks, which I think this will be a really good one. And the story is just this random astronaut in the future from the Galactic Planets Association, and he's wearing a helmet, and he goes to this planet, and it's ruled by robots. And he's greeted by these orange robots. And then he encounters these blue robots. And for all intents and purposes, they're identical, except for some are orange and some are blue. But the orange robots are given privileges and access to knowledge, and they are held, whereas the blue robots are completely repressed and are put into danger and get no rights and no freedoms and no safety. So the astronaut deems that they're not worthy to join the Galactic Planet Federation, and tells them that he will come back, we'll come back and visit you later when you sort this out and you aren't so, separated. And it was enormously, obviously, a racial allegory. And then at the very last panel, the astronaut removes his helmet to reveal that he's a black man. And it's talking about how he was, he's got dark skin, and the beads of sweat reflect on his skin like stars in the night. And it was very poetic and very punctual. I mean, it makes the whole point of the story is it really drives it home when you realize, especially back in like 1954, everybody would have assumed from the beginning that the astronaut was white, so it's a twist ending. Nowadays, if you're enlightened enough, like that, you don't just assume you don't even assume it's a man, and it's like very nondescript spacesuit. It's not like there was boobs on the spacesuit. It could have been a woman,
The spacesuits are they're pretty dumpy. Anyway,
yes,
so
exactly. And it's like a big bowl helmet. But the point of it is that the Comics Code Authority basically shot it down because it was a black man, and they told him, you can run this. You just have to change the guy to a white guy.
And they never really explain why either. Why? They just sort of say he just can't be black.
He just can't be black. And so they get into it, both the writer and the publisher, and they're like, that's the whole freaking point of the story. What are you, no. They're just like, no. And they get into an argument, and they basically, the publisher, Max, I forgot his name because I keep losing my names now. But basically, he's like, okay, here's the deal. You either approve this, or I'm going to go straight to the press, and then I'm going to sue you because you've had it out for us. I mean, you specifically took the names of our comic books, weird, horror, and crime, and you said that we can't use those in our titles. You're obviously targeting us. Right. You've just gone too far. And so the Comics Code Authority replies, fine, we'll compromise. You have to take the beads of sweat off of his face. And they're like, what? It's like, and this is a prime example of how quickly this governing organization got out of hand, and it got to just like, uppity rich white men in a position of power flexing their muscles. And the publisher of EC Comics is like, you know what? He literally just told him to screw off. Not screw off, but you know what the words are. And then hung up the phone on him, and they printed it, and they didn't care. And then basically what they ended up deciding was, at this point, it was just too much to deal with the Comics Code Authority. And so they changed Mad Magazine Mad Comics. They changed Mad Comics from a comic book publication to an honest-to-God magazine publication with a different format, and they added articles and content and things so that it no longer was under the purview of the Comics Code Authority. Mm-hmm. And so that's where the modern Mad Magazine comes from, is because they're like, fine, we'll put all of our eggs into this one basket, and it's what saved their company. And it ended up becoming, to this day, a well-known institution, of stuff. So I think that's a really fun story and a really good example of how and I'm not saying there shouldn't be guidelines and things, but censorship it can get out of hand like really fast.
Well, I think that modern day is. I wish it was more pervasive, but there's a rating system. Different comics, like they have like a rating system on there to give people an idea of what the kind of content.
Yeah,
is. And I think that's ideal. The problem is like we were talking about DC, where they're putting ads in there that aren't appropriate.
Right, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode is the rating system. And where we get to when they start moving away from this.
It's like, but since you know a little bit more about the back end stuff, it's like obviously we went through. It's like most of this is going through the like social end of it, but like how did this regulatory body, besides occasionally saying no like that, affect how people had to go through, how people had to get their comics published?
Well, I want to say that that's one of the main reasons that it went to stores and it stopped being on spinner racks and stuff like that. Because, it kind of killed that in a lot of ways. That one
we'll have to research more because I don't really know which came first, the direct market or the break from the authority. That's one we talked about when we did our episode on direct market.
Once the prices started skyrocketing from,
Well, that's why.
That's why. That's when everything started changing.
Right.
We kind of talked about this in one of the previous episodes.
Well, I think the biggest influence is, and this is one of the things that it's just now starting to really kick in, and you still have people whose brains are programmed that way. For the longest time, your general public synonymously associated comic books and or superheroes as a child's medium.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason for that is because for many, many years, it actually kind of was. What ended up happening is the main, you were asking, how did that end up affecting the actual publication of comic books is when all was said and done, everybody started following suit with EC Comics. There was no point, there was no money to be made. It was so edited out that it wasn't even worth selling. It wasn't worth the effort. And so the industry as itself moved completely away from other genres and they started focusing on Westerns. Westerns became big again. Romance comics. This is like when romance comics became particularly popular. And superheroes. Superheroes, because of the restrictions that you made, specifically because of those restrictions, superheroes were the easiest not only to follow those restrictions, but to also subversively buck those restrictions. Mm-hmm. Because it was a fantasy medium that was designed so specifically that allegorically you could actually kind of get away with stuff like that. And this is where we get to things like the X-Men. X-Men now, everybody knows that X-Men was an allegory for minorities, social outcasts. And everybody from homosexuals to blacks to just any kind of disenfranchised or fringed minority associates that mutant struggle. And this is where the Comics Code Authority had that influence. Because of the restrictions, writers had to find more creative ways to make these points and stories and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this isn't just comics. There's also on television. I mean, that's one of the big reasons why Star Trek was so amazing, was because they fit these social issues into their stories. You know what I mean? Like, I think one of the best ones is the one with Frank Gorshin in it,
mm-hmm.
where half of him is black and half of him is white, and they did the whole plan. They've killed everybody. There's only one with black on the right side and one on the white on the left side, and then the other one that's black on the left side and white on the right side, and they're the last two beings on their planet. They've killed everybody else
because
they're still fighting because
they're reversed.
Yeah, and I think Kirk says, what, you're exactly the same. He's like, no, I'm not. I'm black on the right side.
Right. Like, how do you not notice?
It's like, what? So
yeah.
It's like,
but yeah, that's kind of what I mean about the comic books is that the two main things is that basically they either wrote to children, because those were just easier, or they found ways around it. But this is what ends up leading to the pop cultural awareness of superheroes and comic books as being a kid's medium. So yeah, what was your other question you had? You said there was another good discussion question. I can't see it on the board.
Oh, it's basically that. Just how did the actions of the Comics Code Authority change how people view comics and comic book characters? Which it's like the other ones were the names, but it's still interesting to draw the parallel between that and video games because comics were considered a general form of entertainment back then. It's like the way people viewed it is kids are going to see this no matter what. And so instead of making this distinction between, well, we're going to have kids stuff and then we're going to have adult stuff like we do more today, they just said, okay, you have to make all of it suitable that whether a kid or adult picks it up, they can read it and not have like their delicacies or something offended. I don't know the word.
Which is really funny if you watch the modern Sabrina or Archie, they are anything but
it is not.
It is not kid friendly.
No.
Even though Archie was relatively unaffected when the Comics Code Authority happened. They were like, okay.
This is
the original Archie.
Yeah, the original Archie comic books, because of the Comic Book Authority, really, really picked up. Because they were a combination of humor and romance comic books. And they became their whole line, Sabrina, Kate Kane, Juicy and the Pussycats, all were popular because of, they were like the last man standing kind of thing. They were your only alternative. So
is that why they're still in grocery stores, basically?
They're an institution. Basically, the other thing that really hurt comic books, and it happened at almost the same time, is comic books were originally a broad spectrum because they were cheap. They were your only visual alternative to the radio, so everybody could afford them. Everybody got, and they were the masses, and it was when television started becoming affordable to the masses that they really hit a decline. And that was right shortly after the congressional hearings at the beginning of the 50s. And so you started having televisions every home, and the majority of your television programs, with except for obviously one in the 50s, Superman, were comedies, sitcoms, or romance dramas. So all the medical drama comic books, most of the romance comic books were gone, and that's why for so long everybody just assumes that comic books and superheroes are the same thing. And it's like, no, superheroes are one genre. Comic books can be anything. Comics are like movies. It's like saying all comic books are superhero. You can only do comic book superheroes. Like saying all movies have to be westerns. It's ridiculous. And I don't know why people just assume when you hear comic book, but it's because for a long time, once television came in and kicked the majority of the genres off the racks, you had superheroes and Archie.
Right. It's like, and looking at some of this, it's so interesting because most of people I know who are in their late 20s, early 30s have a story of accidentally learning about like some sort of adult comic or adult themed cartoon because of this whole idea of comics and cartoons being synonymous with kids stuff. It's like my favorite one is still, I have a friend who said that his parents let him watch Cool World because
of cartoons.
Because it's a cartoon.
Well, it's and it's funny because people forget that cartoons were not we're going to skip outside of the superhero realm right now. cartoons were not originally written for children. Even the Superman,
it's kind of intertwined with each other.
Even the Superman, even the early Superman comics, it was not intended to be a child's medium. It was just intended to be another artistic expression, and they were used as shorts before movies, as previews, as entertainment for the adults. So they were played before very adult movies. Like I think Porky Pig was the original before he was created before Bugs Bunny. And originally Porky Pig was the Warner Brothers cartoon or the Looney Tunes frontman. And what was it he said? It was like, basically he said he cussed in one of his first cartoons. He stuttered on something. He's like,
oh, did he?
Yeah, it was, I have to go back and look it up. It was like, something, damn it, or something like that. But it was never meant to be for kids. Betty Boop was one of the most popular ones. It was all, she was salacious and, being followed by, grubby men. And it was all straight up, raunchy. I mean, they sanitized her over the years, but like we said, even the cartoons of the time were aimed at adults and adult. I mean, watch some of the very old original Looney Tunes and stuff, and you're like, how did I? I must have been a really innocent kid at the time because I didn't, until I was much older, realize that's wholly inappropriate.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well, that's why parent groups for the longest time have been trying to edit Looney Tunes forever.
Yeah.
I mean, they succeeded. I want to say in the 80s, they started releasing cuts of the Looney Tunes where they cut out a lot of the violence and a lot of the stuff like that.
There are a few banned episodes of like Looney Tunes.
Oh yeah.
They're still floating around if you look for them.
And we're going to bring up Bosco on the Black Lives Matter one, but
and there's also a lot of Mickey Mouse cartoons that are. I mean, obviously, like the movie Song of the South.
Yeah,
you're probably never going to see that again,
right? And a lot of wartime stuff has sort of
all the wartime, because it's all so much of the war stuff. Wartime stuff was
episode with Mickey Mouse. That's one of my favorite Mickey Mouse cartoons, where soot comes down on Mickey Mouse's face and turns him into blackface, and he goes, "Mammy, Mammy," and so that's a banned cartoon now.
Wow!
Oh no!
Yeah, so I mean, there was a lot of racist stuff.
Oh yeah,
a lot of cartoons back then.
Right,
and then the comic books,
the Donald Duck Nazi cartoon, that was a fun one.
Yeah. So for do we want to? I know you've been wanting to talk for a while about the restrictions actors had in their real lives for being superheroes. Do you want to talk about George Reeves?
Yeah. So part of
that's all effects entertainment too.
Yeah, and we're going to get into the more modern stuff next week. But this is where we're talking about the classics of them continuing.
I highly suggest watching the movie Hollywoodland. I don't know how exactly
it's
accurate.
So
I know some of the scenes in there are completely accurate.
I went through the actual like factor fiction of that one,
and
apparently, aside from a couple of compressed for time things, they said yes, it was pretty accurate.
Yeah. George Reeves was a heavy smoker. He had to not smoke in public at all because of being Superman.
Yep.
Right? Because they changed everything, and instead of superheroes being a for everybody thing, it became this is for children, and you have to present yourself like you are performing for children. And this was long before any stuff that is acceptable now. So yeah, the idea of your superhero smoking.
I know. Oh my gosh.
It's like these groups that were wanting everything to be like proper and kid friendly would be like, well, if they see that Superman's smoking and Superman's for kids, they're going to think, oh, it's cool for me to smoke.
Yeah.
And there was a really horrifying moment where he went to perform at an event where he was Superman at an event, and a little child came up to him with a loaded gun.
I remember that story. They touch on that story in Hollywoodland. It is crazy.
And the kid asked if he could shoot Superman to watch the bullet bounce off of his chest.
Oh boy!
And George Reeves talked him down, saying that he didn't want the bullet ricocheting into the crowd and hurting somebody.
Which, good on him for thinking that fast. Because I would, because that scene.
But he got the gun away from the kid safely without scaring the kid, without scaring anybody.
I just want to know how that kid got a gun.
Right.
It was his parents' gun.
That's what scared me about the scene, because it's so casual. He just walks up and is like, "Can I shoot you?" And I remember being like, "That's."
And he looked, and you could see the bullets because it was a revolver.
And and he manages to talk him out of it, but it was so casual, and I'm like, how did you manage to
not
get your
freak
parents'
out,
gun, get outside, and be able to like get past a big crowd of people in order to
security
point
like they
at
do
him?
now.
Yeah,
they didn't have security like they do now.
That's probably why.
And George Reeves, not only coming up with like a good retort but doing it on a nicotine fit at the same time.
Right, and he did it so. It's like the depictions I've seen of it. It's such a calm, like it's really tense, but he manages to keep it together long enough to talk this kid down without like terrifying a big group of kids. Yeah. And I was like, good on him.
He also, after that, he did a lot of PSAs on guns and stuff like that.
Good.
He was that was one of the first instances where he like actually demanded, I need to do PSAs on guns and stuff because this happened to me. And
right, and also in general, just like if you're so loose with your guns that your kid could walk out with one without any sort of maintenance at all.
Yeah.
Because that's what I'm assuming, is that it wasn't just they were like, sure, little Timmy, you can have my gun.
Right.
He snuck it out and decided to do this. And it's like, if it got that loose, something needed to be said about it. And he knew what kind of power he had as Superman, even if he hated it.
Mm-hmm.
And so to be able to take that and turn it around and be like, yes, I'm going to do PSAs about this. Good on him.
And he was really good with the kids. He would actually rip the S off of his shirt after they were done filming and hand it to a kid as he walked out.
Yeah, I love that.
So he did a lot of really wonderful things, and he was
he's such a tragic character, but he was such a genuinely good dude, though.
And
but that's one of the things about the comic books being so closely associated with superheroes, and that censorship. And there's a lot of scholastic argument as to, yes, there's a lot of people who say the Comics Code Authority really hurt comic books, and there are lots of ways that it did, but also, in the same way, we would not have superheroes the way we do today if it weren't for the authority, because it basically, Comics Code Authority in the long run distilled the medium from a wide range of genre into what eventually was the only game in town. You like I said, you have superheroes or Archie, and even Archie went superhero for a while. And so then,
Archie's done everything.
Archie's done everything.
They've had werewolves, they've had vampires, Vampronica.
Right. Now I'm talking before modern times. Modern times, they've really capitalized on a lot of that. The afterlife of Archie, we can talk about.
Oh, right.
We can talk about that next week. But even in the 50s, or maybe even in the 60s and 70s, they had Red Circle Comics, which was Archie's superhero line. Yeah. And if you watch the the Riverdale TV show, it's an inside, Easter egg, because when Archie forms his little vigilante team in the show, he calls it the Red Circle, and it's a reference to the superhero line that Archie Comics did. It's actually a direct nod to that. But everything was superheroes. So the superhero medium became the dominant, or genre became the dominant genre in the medium for so long that until like next week we'll get into underground and indie stuff. Yeah. But superheroes were so much saturated in that they were forced to develop those, and that's where we get this huge swath of variety of characters and creations and designs and stuff. And
I really think that the Comic Code Authority in a lot of ways made the creators be more creative.
Exactly.
Yeah, because they couldn't just resort to whatever in order to.
So I think in some ways it helped the superhero genre specifically in a lot of ways, but especially with Batman and with Superman, because the golden age of Superman. Superman's a jerk.
Oh yeah.
Superman's a real jerk. He is not. He is not the Christopher Reeve.
I don't know if it's still up. But if you can find it, there is this page this guy used to do. It's called Super Dickery, and superdickery.com, just like it sounds. And if you go to it, and it started off with just Superman. He started doing it with other superheroes from the Golden Age too, but they're just single panels, and sometimes you don't even need the context to know that it was just completely awful. And sometimes it's not intentionally awful, but out of context, it is super funny, And there's so many things that, and we talk about how language evolves and how, connotations of things evolve. It's really funny to see some of these things from the 40s, and you're like, Superman said what?
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
But we're running out of time, so I just wanted to say real quick that I think that a lot of the actors learned a lot of stuff from George Reeves going forward. That's one of the reasons why Christopher Reeve, when he chose to be Superman, he immediately went and did several really kind of other films that were like not anywhere close to being Superman, to not pigeonhole him.
Yeah,
George Reeves.
Even Chris Evans recently did that to separate himself from Captain America. But one last thing,
watch Knives Out, please.
Knives Out, yes, right. So on that note, Cost of Superheroes, make sure you check them out. Cost of Superhero Run from our volunteer group.
Yeah.
We also follow the Superman code with our volunteer group. All of our superheroes remain in character and remain kid friendly and appropriate. So, and we're supporting the Cost of Superhero Run. What's their page?
CostofSuperheroRun.com.
Yeah, they can't do the run this year. It's digital. So make sure you check in and donate and help support this wonderful cause.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye. I think we're going to be talking through the credits now.
Yay.
It's a new thing.
Oh,
so, I don't know.
Gavin?
Yay.
There we go.